What's up, everyone? Welcome to Akuma's Arsenal, and today we will be discussing the history of Seiko. So, I love Seiko. I have handled many watches by Seiko, and consistently they deliver a extremely valuable product for a very low price point. It's something that Seiko has been doing for a very long time. I've handled their mid-range watches, watches that retailed even when they came out around $1,000. I haven't handled any Grand Seikos. I have seen a few King Seikos in the flesh. However, in short, Seiko is a company that I admire a lot of, and pretty much my favorite brand when it comes to watchmaking, period. So, let's get started. Humble beginnings create a solid foundation. So, Kinataro Hattori founded Seiko in 1881. I'm not exactly for sure if he's related to the Hanzo Hattori family that was famous, actually some famous ninjas during during the Sengoku Jidai era. So I wonder if he's from that same clan. I'm not exactly for sure. So Japan's history with clockmaking goes very far back. Around 1680, vocational schools were set up in the Nagasaki prefecture, which taught how to make organs, clocks, and astrological equipment. These schools were set up by Christian missionaries when Japan was unified in around 1617. And then afterwards, during that time, if you guys are familiar with Japanese history, there was a crackdown on Christianity in Japan. So, I mean, these schools ceased to exist. And Japan started to create Japan had its own system of telling time. And the clocks that they called were Wadoke clocks. So the Japanese used the lunar calendar, a variant of the lunar calendar. Each day was divided between night and day, dictated by the sunrise and sunset. So if you guys are familiar with Roman timekeeping, very similar to that. And as you know, it's actually a really complicated way to tell time, because think about it. If midnight and noon, so let's say noon every single day had to be sunset, and noon had to be sunrise, right? So the day might, how throughout the year, daylight takes up most of the time, then during winter, darkness takes up most of the time. So your timekeeping system has to account for that. So it's a very complicated way of telling time, but it's very easy to do, because the one thing that you were able to know every single day is when the sun sets and when the sun rises. So it is fairly complicated, but I mean, let's just say that in Japan wasn't using the Gregorian calendar as we are today. So each period was divided into another 6, kind of like the Roman time system, but instead of 12 and 12, it's 6 and 6, because the amount of sunlight changes throughout the day, throughout the year. So did the Wadoke. So imagine a clock that has to keep account for the variance in time like that. These are very complicated instruments, and these are not easy to make. You guys really should check out some of the ancient methods of keeping time, because trust me, you look at a mechanical wristwatch now and you think it's complicated, but man, imagine trying to tell the time. Very simply with sundials, I guess, but they get very complicated very quickly. And many had alarms, and I believe it's Callions, basically a big bell. During the Meiji Reformation, Japan adopted the solar calendar, the one in use today. So the Meiji Restoration was a time period in Japan where Japan really wanted to modernize very quickly. So you can say modernize, or you can use westernize. So they started adopting Western culture, Western basically Western culture, military tactics, government systems. Japan was like, alright, this is superior to the way we're doing it, so they adopted the new system. So during that time period, all of the clocks that they had been making up to that point had become obsolete, right? And the Meiji Restoration happened about 1872, and this is where we start to see the beginning of Seiko. So Seiko was started in 1892-ish. No. It was started in 1887. So Kinataro Hattori started a clock repair service because in that time period when they adopted the solar calendar, they just really imported a lot of clocks from the West. So let's say Switzerland, Britain, wherever they could get their clocks, right? So Kinataro Hattori started a clock repair service. In 1892, he bought a factory in Tokyo, and Seikosha was born. If you guys are wondering what Seikosha is, if you haven't heard it, you might have heard me talking about it through some of the live streams. Seikosha is Seiko's name for its old clocks, its what else? Pocket watches, things like that. And they used to use Seiko branding for wristwatches. So, but Seikosha means house of exquisite taste, or house of refinement, or something along those lines. So, progression. They began making wall clocks, then pocket watches, alarm clocks, and then wristwatches. During the first Showa era, so the first Showa era I believe is 1922 up until maybe like 1933. The company continued to grow. Pocket watches were branded Seikosha, like I said, while wristwatches were branded Seiko. Just said that. In the second Showa era, Seiko supplies the Japanese military with watches during World War II. If you aren't familiar with World War II, Japan entered war with China many years before the Nazis ever set foot in Poland. Before the World War II started in Europe, that's not even before World War II got to Europe. World War II was starting in Asia, and I think we know now, looking back, that it was Japan who was the main belligerent there. This time period in Seiko's history is kind of forgotten a little bit. If you keep your eyes open, you can find some World War II Seiko wristwatches. They're very small. A lot of you, they will not be your cup of tea, but I really do hope to have one in my collection one day. So this is where Seiko starts in the 1960s, right? This is when Seiko really starts competing with the Swiss. So they enter competitions with the Swiss, and they're battling it out, right? So during the 1960s, there was a race to create the first commercial quartz watches. It was Swiss versus Seiko. I repeat again, it was the Swiss versus Seiko. It was the whole manufacturing capabilities of a country versus this one company called Seiko. The CEH, which is the Swiss Research Center, it was the Swiss Research Center versus Seiko. So it was Shoji Hattori. I mean, Seiko is a family-run company and has been for a very long time. I'm not exactly for sure it is today, but Shoji Hattori mandated that in 1 year we're gonna have a commercial quartz wristwatch. He was like, 1 year, that's my mandate. So, and boom, there we go. 1 year later, his company delivered, and there we go, the first commercial quartz wristwatch in history, made by Seiko. So when you hear people say Seiko invented the first quartz wristwatch, no, it created the first commercial quartz wristwatch, which in reality is all that really matters. So I want to just give you an idea of Seiko, how its growth progressed throughout the years. So in 1965, Seiko produced 1.6 million wristwatches. In 1969, it produced 4.9 million wristwatches. That's a lot, right? 1.6 million to 4.9. In 1977, so about 10 years later, 8 years later, Seiko produces 11.8 million wristwatches. About 24 years after that, in 2001, Seiko produced 21 million wristwatches. Now, I don't know what those numbers are today. However, just think about that. 21 million wristwatches. 21 million. Crazy. That's an insane amount of product. And I want to give you a basic rundown. I'll see if I can include a picture of that diagram I drew. I want to explain to you why the Japanese were the first to create the first commercial quartz wristwatch. Well, it was because Seiko was a very, very top-down company. It was, just imagine, let me just explain like this. Seiko was a self-contained industry where they manufactured pretty much every single part that they needed, right? Every single part, down to the column wheels, to the springs, the gears, everything. Seiko produced everything in-house, right? Their research was in-house, their manufacturing was in-house, their product development was in-house, the marketing was in-house, excuse me. But the Swiss were very, very different. Just imagine this. If you had 500 companies, let's say you have a company called Jingle Doop, and it only produces a certain size spring and maybe like a couple others. Let's bring it. It only produced springs, right? And there's another company that only produced gears, and there was another company that only produced dials, and there was another company that only produced cases. And they have to sort of work with each other, all these different separate entities, to create a product, right? And the problem with that was, I mean, yes, you get some very, very high quality materials that are made really well. That company that makes dials might make the best dials, right, in the world. The thing is, though, is that it was very, very, very easy for things to get backed up, right? I mean, if you rely on, let's say, 3 companies to create cases for your whole industry, and let's say in like 2 out of 3 of those companies, they have backups for whatever reason, well then all watch manufacturing gets held up, right? So the reason why Seiko is able to produce so many of those cheaper wristwatches and all throughout history was just because everything was in-house. They could figure, okay, we need to create the Seiko 5, we need to create the King Seiko, the Grand Seiko, blah 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 blah, because just imagine it's a very top-down hierarchical structure, while as the Swiss watch industry was a bit more organic. But you'd think that the organic structure would be a bit better than the top-down approach. However, the problem was that there was no clear vision from the top, and that's why Seiko was able to beat out the Swiss I don't know. I don't want to say beat out the Swiss in general, but that's how Seiko was able to keep in the game, whether it was the research, whether it was the manufacturing, whether it was anything. It was because Seiko controlled everything on the inside. And so it really just had a better organizational structure. Yep, and that is part 1 of the history of Seiko. Just sort of my brief rundown of the whole, pretty much the whole entire history of the company. Very, 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 very rough. I encourage you to click the link in the description for the PDF. It's called Seiko, The History in Time. It's a PDF that gives a very detailed outlook on Seiko. I definitely recommend it. In part 2, we'll be looking more about the particular wristwatches that Seiko released during its time. We'll be taking a look at all the things from the very beginning of Seiko, the clocks, all that stuff, and we will push it all the way from the clocks to the very first pocket watches, to the watches, to the to what it was producing in World War II, and also in the interwar period in the 50s and the 60s. We'll talk about maybe in another part Grand Seiko versus King Seiko. I want to create a series where I really, really, really dive deep into this company. My favorite company of all time, Seiko and Vostok. Thank you very, very, very much for watching. If you have any recommendations, if you have any feedback, you have any comments, you have anything you want to say, leave it in the comment section. Thank you very, very, very much for watching, and Akuma out.